anyway, I really appreciate you all coming tonight. This is one of my favorite topics to talk on. Just a little bit about myself. I'm the founder of greenmedinfo.com. That's really primarily what I do. It's a project that is a collaborative effort of researchers putting together data from the National Library of Medicine that supports natural medicine. So we have over 1,500 substances indexed and 2,700 ailments. So if you have anything really you can think of in terms of a classical disease, we should have peer-reviewed medical literature that you can access for free because it's an open access database. And that's something that houses a lot of my research on wheat, which we'll show you in a little bit. I'm also the author of an essay series called The Dark Side of Wheat. So we'll be talking a little bit about the themes of that essay. I just reread it before I came up here, and I must say I'm a better writer than speaker. So I'm going to try to do justice to what I presented there. But it is something that I think will contribute to changing the way people look at both celiac disease and then generally wheat intolerance. I want to shift the debate away from there being a sort of unhealthy reaction to an intrinsically healthy grain, because wheat is considered by both secular and spiritual traditions alike to be a glorified food. Yes. The Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, which is the United Nations arm for defeating world hunger, has a picture of a wheat grain on its emblem, and "Let there be bread" is their actual, in Latin, motto. And then you go to the Catholic Church, and the Eucharist wafer is the body of Christ, is wheat. Okay, so for the longest time, even when they realized how serious and life-threatening a condition celiac was, they resisted offering a wheat-free alternative because it was considered truly the body of Christ. So this is a glorified grain, and it is truly, I believe, something that can unlock the secret as to why humans are the sickest animals that have ever appeared on this planet. We are, without a doubt, the sickest animal on this strange planet of ours. And so I'm going to get a little bit into the biology, the toxicology, and the history of wheat consumption and how it affects us right now in many ways that we're not fully aware of. My other role is down in Naples. I'm the nutrition director at the Naples Birth Center. And then also I help to manage and educate for a health food store down in Benita Springs. But really, if you want to get in contact with me, you can email me through ReMedInfo. I've got cards, and also a email list which we send out an email every 3 days. And we have writers who are lawyers and PhDs and doctors and your whole spectrum. So it's sometimes a little intense. I don't know if any of you get the Mercola newsletter. Well, so you're used to getting every
We were
day.
just talking about, right?
It gets a little overwhelming.
It's
Okay,
like,
yeah.
I'm going to
Yeah.
die. There's nothing to put in my mouth.
It's a profound service. If you read through the articles, you'll find they're
There's some
very
great
helpful.
info, yes.
But it is a daily thing. So I feel a little bit uncomfortable doing every 3 days, but we have so many writers and so much research to communicate. So, of course, if you don't like it, feel free to unsubscribe. So my presentation tonight, we're just going to ask some basic questions, like, is wheat a health food? Most do believe it is. And then really looking at what wheat is basically on a biochemical level, because it's a very unique grain. I don't know if any of you know this, but it's classified as a hexaploid species. So it actually has 6 sets of chromosomes. It's a byproduct of 3 different plants becoming one. And because it has such a density of inherited information, it has 6.5 times more genes than the human genome. And that's important because each gene, in theory, is able to produce protein. Now we know that genes can produce many proteins. The old school thought before the Human Genome Project was completed, the first draft in 2005, was that if you could discover the genome of the human, you could then really discover what causes most disease and how to cure it. It was the holy grail. And they anticipated there'd be 100,000 genes because there's 100,000 proteins in the human body. But they found, unfortunately, that there's only 25,000 at most, which means that that whole vision completely collapsed overnight. So in connection with wheat, you have a number of genes that can produce a number of proteins. And technically right now, the estimates are between 23,000 to 27,000 proteins exist in wheat, all distinctly different. And that's a big issue because when you're thinking about how the immune system might adversely respond to a protein, proteins are antigenic. They have the potential to elicit an immune response that may not be so positive. So of course, if you have intestinal permeability, you're eating, a slice of bread, give it 20, 30 minutes, and then some of those proteins go undigested and into your bloodstream, well, it's likely it's going to elicit an immune response, which then compromises really the integrity of the whole organism because you have lost self-tolerance. Okay, so the immune system is attacking proteins that it thinks is really invading its body when it, in fact, it's food. And those antibodies can cross-react with self-structures. So this is the basis for autoimmunity. And there are many ways in which autoimmunity can be elicited, but wheat is, without a doubt, one of the primary elicitors of that lack of self-tolerance or the breakdown of integrity within the immune system. We can get into the details of why that is. There's a lot of new research out there as to how the intestinal lining functions. There are certain proteins that regulate permeability. One of them is known as zonulin, and I believe this research is only about 10 years old. But it shows that gliadin, which is one of the many thousands of proteins within wheat, and there's approximately 150 different genes dedicated to just producing gliadins. So that's one subcategory of this vast array of proteins within wheat. Because, again, I'm bringing this point up because people think of gluten as just this monolithic entity, when in fact it's a much more complex picture. So anyway, gliadin has been shown clinically in both those with celiac disease proper, classically defined, intestinal biopsy and genetic testing and all that. And they found that in those without it, it elicits a very similar response, which is it causes the junctures between those intestinal cells to open up. So those enterocytes, they're only, actually your intestinal wall is only one cell thick. So they start to actually open up, causing permeability. So it's as if the plant had designed a set of defenses that make it hard for us to consume it without it causing this response. It's very interesting. I was recently in contact with Dr. Davis. He's the author of Wheat Belly. Are you familiar with the book?
Familiar with the doctor.
Okay, yeah. Yeah?
My father's cardiologist.
Oh, get out of here, really? Oh, wow. Well, his, just last week when I was checking, his Wheat Belly book is now, it was number 12, New York Times bestseller. And it's interesting because the wheat lobby is going after him. In fact, they've called the people that read the book and believe what he's saying is somewhat true to be, crazy. And so, in part, we were in contact because they want to produce a sort of nonprofit organization that would help disseminate information on the many adverse effects associated with wheat consumption. And so what's happened is that there are certain, quote, species of disease that are okay when it comes to wheat toxicity, okay? And it's really blame the victim, okay? When you have celiac disease, it's a genetically based disorder. It's not something that you could have necessarily controlled. They don't explain the research on, for example, breastfeeding duration is hugely responsible for whether or not you activate the celiac disease genes. Here's a really important point, is that a study was performed on many different people throughout the world, different ethnic backgrounds, and found that 20 to 25% of those individuals had the genetic locus for celiac disease susceptibility on chromosome 6, okay? Because that's the locus. It's called the human leukocyte antigen DQ2 or 8 gene. And so that proves that not everyone obviously has celiac disease. If you go into someone's intestine, do a biopsy, and look for the flattened villi, and then the crypts between the sort of mountains of the villi, which are the finger-like projections that absorb all your nutrients, there's called hyperplasia. It fills in. It's just flat. You can't absorb anything. You can go into people's intestines and not find that permutation of wheat toxicity or intolerance, because a good portion of what's happening is beneath sort of the celiac disease iceberg. That's a metaphor a number of researchers have used, because it's the only way you can explain why, at least in my own research, and which is freely available for you to view, there's 125 different diseases that are connected to meat consumption. From the National Library of Medicine, peer-reviewed, first-hand research that you can view for yourselves. So the issue is so much larger than celiac disease. And celiac disease has been coveted. There are all these national organizations that have really, it's almost what Carolyn Mace says is sort of woundology. You know, when you have celiac disease, you truly are expected to consider yourself a victim, and it's truly it's a form of isolation that is very psychologically traumatic, because suddenly almost anything you could eat anymore that everyone else is enjoying could theoretically kill you in parts per million. So it is a really serious condition. But you know what the author of Wheat Belly has found is that they'll go after you if you even try to imply that beyond a genetically based or a antibody or allergy based diagnosis of wheat intolerance, that there could be a problem for anyone else. And what I know to be true, and what the research seems to clearly show, is that there's such a broad range of serious health problems. And I can go into the exact detail because others have done this for us already. Like the author of Paleo Diet, it's sort of more of a mass market book, but if you look at his actual research, this is one of the most profound scholars with such a depth of scientific insight. Lauren Cordain, he's written a number of academic articles, but one of his focuses is on heart disease, and how when you look at the slippery lining of the nasal passages and the gastrointestinal tract, and basically epithelial tissue, it could be the bladder, right, or the arteries, there's a slippery mucus, which is called the glycocalyx. And it is composed of several things: sialic acid and N-acetylglucosamine. Okay, these are two of the components. Well, it turns out that wheat contains a very specific chemical. It's called a glycoprotein or lectin, called wheat lectin, that attaches to those membranes, causing inflammation. And so one of his newsletters, which is actually linked on my website, goes into the well-known mechanism by which wheat lectin could stimulate a atherosclerotic process, or could injure the lining of the arteries or blood vessels, which is the first stage of heart disease. We'll get into a little bit of that down the road. It's hard because there's so many aspects to this to kind of really thematize it, but we're going to try. So another question is, how long have we been eating wheat? I mean, we think about it in terms of like cultural time, and it seems like eons. You know, you think back to the Fertile Crescent, you know, go back about 10,000 years ago, and it seems like, you know, that is when people started to consume wheat. You know, the end of the last ice age, 20,000 years ago. We went from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic transition, this dramatic world historical leap from being hunters and gatherers, who never even thought of consuming a grass, much less the grain of a grass, or to sit around and try to gather them all day and then do what with them, because you have to have pyrotechnology, you have to have the ability to produce porcelain, you know, or some type of ceramic in order to cook it and to contain it. I mean, this leap is just so dramatic, and it's the basis for where we are today. Because, you know, one of my professors in college used to say, missing is any sense that anything is missing. Like we went through this sort of event horizon in consciousness, which corresponded perfectly with a profound change in our diet. So now here we are in the Neolithic period still. Every day we eat grains or secondary reiterations of grains. So, you know, you give the grains to the animals and we eat that. Or you produce, you know, corn syrup instead of sugar. And the point basically is, in biological time, it's a nanosecond. We've been consuming sort of hunter-gatherer based foraging, eating animals, or other things that were sprouted or in whole form. You didn't have to cook them for literally eons and eons. And so suddenly we transitioned to this diet. So the larger horizon is truly the grain-based diet is completely genetically incompatible with our bodies. Now we've adapted, and many of us, we know, I mean, we have billions of people on this planet thanks to that diet. I mean, there's no way you could sustain billions of nomadic hunters, you know? I mean, that's just not possible. But that's the deeper subtext, the prehistorical aspect of why we're intolerant to wheat. Now, wheat is, without a doubt, the most heavily manipulated of all grains. I mean, because of the way in which the gluten content was increased over time intentionally, you know, the sort of exoteric explanation is it was for the bread making and the appealing properties of gluten. You know, gluten means glue in Latin. It's chewy, it's gooey, and without it, you can't really produce a good bread. I mean, back in Jesus' time, you know, they snapped the bread. It didn't have a lot of gluten. And so that substance happens to have highly addictive properties, pharmacologically active properties. One of them, we talked about this earlier, is glutamic acid. Technically, almost all grains have a category of protein known as prolamins. Okay, so avidin in oats, seculin in rye, fortin in barley, zyne in corn, and gluten, which again we know now is a far larger category than just one protein in wheat. And it's high in proline and glutamine, or glutamic acid. That amino acid just excites our palate. You could spray MSG on roadkill and eat it, and you probably couldn't stop yourself from devouring it. I mean, that's how addictive MSG is. We know now, too, that it scars the hypothalamus and blocks leptin, which is an essential hormone for suppressing appetite. So grains have within them a very interesting design because, you know, again, these are the babies of the grasses. They want to live on into the future, so they've designed themselves with a rather elaborate set of protections. I mean, one of the more biblical approaches to, you know, our relationship to the earth is, oh, we have dominion over nature, and everything that's there is, you know, meat on our table. And unfortunately, that's not what the science bears testimony to, is that every organism on the planet, and almost everything we eat, excluding honey and milk, and especially, you know, milk for our own species, we consume the wrong milk, really is not meant to be consumed by us. So there's always going to be some give and take. You know, the grains are going to be eaten, of course, and if they're like the dicotyledonous plants, which are the two-leaved embryos, which we sustained millions of years eating, because the preponderance of the evidence shows that we lived in the sort of equatorial jungle type of atmosphere for quite some time, and that the type of foods we would consume would be like the fruit. It's the perfect example of a food for the human that was designed so that we disperse the seed and we get to eat the flesh of the plant. That's just not how grains are designed. They're not, the storage proteins known as glutens are actually there for that plant, you know, to survive a colder temperature and then, you know, produce a sprout later. So anyway, there is a deep, you know, prehistory to our metabolism that I think once we start understanding that, and again, I'm not a complete grain-free person. I'm not stupid. I love grains, and you know, they are like a treat to me. I'll eat gluten-free, and this is something that you'll be interested to find is that, and maybe it's disturbing, but a lot of grains that are not gluten-containing have similar problems. Like we talked about prolamines, those sticky, glutinous proteins, but they also have lectins that are a problem. So rice, barley, even potato, and then tomato and wheat, they all have a similar category of lectin. It's called chitin binding. Let me give you a quick example. Okay. Why is it that millions of Americans buy glucosamine every single day? I mean, is it because they've, you know, been marketed to really well and they're just told it's good for them and they spend all this money? No, it's because it works. Osteoarthritis is almost universal. It's just a matter of degree in the Western grain-based diet, and there's other aspects to this, but anyway, it's because glucosamine is actually extracted from the exoskeleton of sea bugs. Okay, you have crabs, you have lobster, you have shrimp. Now, is osteoarthritis a lack of the bodies of bugs or sea bugs? No. But why does it work? It's because wheat lectin selects specifically for N-acetylglucosamine and again sialic acid. So when you consume glucosamine, it's binding to those bodies of those sea bugs and not to our own tissues. So that specific mechanism, see the word select and the word lectin share the same root because it's such a specific honing in to one biomolecule. N-acetylglucosamine happens to be the basis for our epithelial tissue, our connective tissue, and our neurological tissue. In fact, it's an atypical neurotransmitter. So what I'm saying is that wheat lectin was designed to really make it very hard for us to consume this category of food. It really was the perfect design. Now, it turns out that wheat lectin attaches to the external part of fungi, which would be found in the soil, bacteria, because the cell wall bacteria also has N-acetylglucosamine, insects, N-acetylglucosamine, rodents, humans. It was an ingenious design because every single predator of wheat, and specifically the seed, contains a biomolecule that lectin will attach to and cause problems with. So, yeah, that's, I mean, I have a whole article just on this one topic. It's called Opening Pandora's Breadbox, the Critical Role of Wheat Lectin in Human Disease. And the basic fundamental thing here for everyone to understand is that in order to experience a serious adverse effect from wheat, there doesn't have to be immune mediation. This is the key point, because if you go see your physician, let's say you have wheat belly, you feel bloated, inflamed when you eat wheat, you stop eating it, you feel better. And since they do an intestinal biopsy, I would never want anyone to go through that kind of procedure to know not to eat wheat, but this is the classically defined way you do it. They go in, they see if the intestinal villi in the biopsy is flat. Well, or they get the antibody testing, which is very helpful because now we're finding that a number of people who, let's say, have type 1 diabetes, you do an antibody sweep of their blood and you find the same antibodies produced as if you have celiac disease. So the anti-gliadin antibodies are very high. And we know that the antibodies produced, the anti-gliadin in type 1 diabetics, cross-react with the beta cells in the pancreas, causing destruction of the insulin-producing cells. So it's very clear, the biology. Doesn't mean that it causes this in everyone, obviously, and there's several phases to that. But so the whole point is you go in, they do the antibody test, they don't find a positive reading for the anti-gliadin antibody or anti-endomycin or several of the other ones, and they say, guess what? You have no problem with wheat, you know, where they get your intestinal biopsies back and you're fine, because that's the way that clinical science works today. Is if their limits of knowing determine what is the ultimate truth. It's so sad. So really the best thing to do is to eliminate it if you haven't already and see how you feel. And if you really want to experiment, you could reintroduce it. But that, I think, is really the future of the awareness regarding why wheat is a problem. Shifting the perspective away from blame the victim, they must be a genetic freak, wheat is an intrinsically wholesome and even holy food, how could you possibly react adversely to it? To understanding that technically, having diarrhea, for example, in response to eating something that's not good for you is the perfect response. I mean, that's the naturopathic perspective to disease anyway. You get a virus, you starve the virus, and you just let that stuff come out. You don't suppress the symptom with Imodium or something crazy like that. You get a fever, you don't just pop an antipyretic, which have been actually proven not to be effective, just to lower your temperature, because your fevers actually inhibit viral replication. So, in other words, shifting the perspective from the classical intolerant symptoms to wheat, from being bodily deviance to bodily intelligence. And we are finding this is true for a number of disorders. So, for example, malaria, sickle cell anemics are less likely to be susceptible to that parasite. Cystic fibrosis, which is another disorder that's highly connected to malabsorption, more likely to survive cholera. So these adaptations have helped us survive certain pathogens or certain dietary components. Now here's the really interesting story. Go back to Roman times. It was known as the Wheat Empire. Its entire dominance as a culture lay in its ability to generate and secure and maintain a wheat economy. They would actually conquer other peoples, convert them to the agrarian mode, which is an impoverished lifestyle, and those who resisted are still today some of the most highest prevalence of celiac disease. So Finns, Irish, Scots, some of the Germanic tribes, because they didn't have to go through what were fundamentally a bunch of genetic die-offs. So what I'm saying is that there was once a universal species-specific intolerance to wheat. And because of pressures that were probably likely induced through the end of the last ice age, so environmental pressures, people were forced to consume it. There was nothing else. And even today, grains are a starvation food. If you give more of a ancient, non-agrarian people an alternative to eat pulverized, pasty grass seeds versus an animal product or something like a fruit, good luck. It is a starvation food. So these people ended up dying off, other than those who were resistant. So that explains why people like JFK, his whole life, they were treating him for every imaginable symptom, and they didn't realize that he was just classically celiac disease sufferer. And that just eliminating gluten would have pretty much kept him from having to undergo any more suffering or continued medication. So that's really, I think, important. Now, any questions so far?
What about people who don't exhibit any symptoms?
Yes, thank you. That's the beauty of the iceberg metaphor. You have the tip of the iceberg, which is your celiac disease sufferer, classically defined. You have this huge, massive base of asymptomatic, okay, no symptoms, or out of intestine symptoms. And this is where the research really comes in. Because, I was looking at it initially from a cursory overview of the research. Now, if any of you don't know this, the National Library of Medicine is a godsend. It's probably the top 500 most heavily visited sites on the planet. It's a free service. It used to cost quite a lot to access. And I think it was in the 90s that it was rendered free to the world to use. But this is the global brain at its best, the internet that is. The internet is like Pandora's box, of course. Now, this here, light speed, because the transfer of information today through the internet is actually done through photons, is that you have faster transmission here than you have through the biochemical signals in your brain. So us talking, it's slower than this right here. This is about 2/3 the speed of light. 21 million studies are under your fingertips. So what I did initially is I just type in wheat and look up maybe schizophrenia. It's very interesting. Because I was looking really at the neurological issues and also addictive properties. And I found, going back to, I think it was 1960, research on schizophrenics, some of them actually recovering entirely on a gluten-free diet. It goes back to 1966. Yeah, is celiac disease a clue to the pathogenesis of schizophrenia? So over the course of 3 to 4 years, I've indexed now on this page. This is one of thousands of pages on the site. And this is the wheat page.
Your extended desktop isn't.
Oh gosh.
What's the site again?
Wow, you didn't get to see that,
The
did you?
National Library of Medicine.
Wow, my desktop is
Yeah, the
disappearing.
extended.
Oh.
You got a shrunk, your browser shrunk or something.
National Library of Medicine?
Probably this. It's called the National Library of Medicine. And, well, I'll show you right here. This is the site. And what it does is it takes all the research that I've gathered over the years and puts them into a field. There's 166 associated diseases and or adverse symptoms. And they cover, okay, let's see, 7 studies on the connection between schizophrenia and wheat.
I've heard depression.
Yeah.
Here's another one, and actually, when I stopped eating wheat, I just felt emotionally much better.
It's a neuroendocrine roller coaster. There are a number of reasons.
Well, sugar and wheat, which are very much
Yeah.
connected anyway,
They
I
are.
think.
Yeah, you're correct, because see, starch generally is a bunch of glucose,
Right.
like polymers, and it's going to break down into, quote, sugar, glucose. So it's going to elicit an insulin response, which is then going to cause the blood to drop, and then you're going to have this roller coaster effect where you're going to want to crave more. And then you have the well-known phenomenon with cereal grasses blocking the leptin receptor in the hypothalamus, which is the mechanism needed to tell you, I'm done eating, I'm full.
Right.
It just blocks it, makes it, it's interesting, the word bulimia means hungry as a cow. If you look at cows, all they do all day long is they eat grass. The grains are much more addictive though.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, if you're a cattle rancher and you try to get your cattle to slaughter weight using a bunch of grass, it's not going to really accelerate the process. You're going to use grain. But if you use it too soon, they get extremely sick. They end up with acidosis and liver abscesses, and they end up having a lot of the same degenerative conditions that humans have. These are the animals that are designed to consume.
Right. That's the problem with the whole beef industry, and also chickens as well.
Yeah.
They're feeding them all these grains, when that's not what evolution has dictated that they should be eating.
Correct.
And then we're eating that,
Exactly.
so you're getting sick, you're getting doubly sick.
Yeah, it's secondary reiteration of the problem. And what happens with grains in general is that you have a prehistorically determined optimal ratio of omega-3 and omega-6, right? So we should be consuming something like a 1 part omega-3 to 1 part omega-6, or all the way up to 1 part omega-3, 4 part omega-6. But you take corn, okay, or wheat, or millet, or any of these grains, and it's about 40 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And the problem is that we co-evolve with foods for such a long period of time that we actually lose the ability genetically to regulate certain types of fats. We can't produce them, they're essential. That's why they're called essential fatty acids. So what happens is called the eicosanoid pathway. You get too much omega-6 and it jacks up your arachidonic acid, which is literally the fuel source for your cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase enzymes, the enzymes associated with inflammation. They literally oxidize that fat, turning it into the inflammatory hormones, prostacyclin, prostaglandin E2, leukotriene, thromboxane. I mean, these are the players in chronic inflammatory disease, which afflicts us all. It's called the diseases of affluence. You know, you have diabetes, you have cardiovascular disease, you have osteoarthritis, you have osteoporosis. I mean, so yes, it's all kind of based on the pyramid of, you know, which is really the grain-based pyramid. You can't get beyond that, you know. So yes, starch even by itself is a big problem. Depression, well, I don't know how anyone could feel good eating wheat. To me, knowing enough about it at this point, I just don't understand how anyone could. Now, antidepressants account for probably the largest category of medications in this country.
Yes,
And the
yes.
thing is, let's say you eat some wheat bread. That glutamic acid is immediately going to stimulate the umami receptors in your tongue. It's like getting a spray of MSG. And it's like, wow, and you just keep eating it. You're not even going to feel full for quite some time. Give it 20, 30 minutes. Some of those gluten proteins are going to be broken down. In fact, gliadin will be broken down into 7-glidorphin. That's a primary opioid-like molecule. And then there's about 5 other what they're called gluten exorphins. These are opioids. So no one questions anymore, biochemically speaking, that these grains, especially wheat, are extremely addictive. And then after the meal, you get the food coma and you just want to self-medicate with a nip of coffee or alcohol or a cigarette, you know, maybe a fight with your partner, you know. That's how you get your adrenaline going. So that's pretty much how, this is just how we live. We're a wheat-based culture.
Well, look at the food pyramid. That's what they told you to eat the most of.
Yeah.
Were
It's,
you disconnected? Is that what happened?
I don't know what happened really. Yeah, that's just it, right? The pyramid is the ultimate.
There's a
destiny.
cord there.
Well, there are some Australian now. This is a different one. It's okay. There's an Australian team of biologists that introduced. Oh, I did. When they introduced the concept of the transition from the hunter-gatherer mode to the grain-based mode, is largely due to the addictive properties of the grain because they have very drug-like properties. I mean, there's an obsessive compulsiveness that comes with,
Yes.
right? And schizophrenia is an example of that.
People, I work with weight loss and overeating, and I was my own experiment. People do not binge on broccoli. No, I'm very serious.
I know.
They
I know.
binge on carbs.
It's a good metaphor, yeah.
That's what they binge on.
Yeah.
Because of the chemical properties that it has in the brain and
Be right
raising
back.
the serotonin in your brain as well. So you get that peaceful,
Yeah.
relaxed feeling.
Yeah, no, you're right, absolutely. I mean, really, it's interesting. There are a type of parasitic mushroom that infects a caterpillar in the Himalayas in the spring, I believe. And it goes into their bodies, it takes over the nervous system, and actually tells it to go over to these specific trees to sit there till the whole body is taken over and turned into a mushroom. So we know that there's relationships in nature where literally you could program another organism by infecting it or by producing certain proteins that would benefit you. Now, it is very likely that the reason why we consume wheat is because of it being sort of a surreptitious control mechanism. It's not unlike why they put fluoride in the water. I mean, they justify it because it's a drug, which violates informed consent. I've never signed up for a prescription for fluoride, but it's almost everything we consume. But that, to me, explains how the Roman Empire used wheat to literally spread imperialism throughout the ancient world, is that they used wheat for bread and circuses. The whole concept was give all the masses free bread. They did this because it was a political strategy, and it worked. They ended up going to the Colosseums, and you just imagine the cruelty of those days. And they just get free bread. And because they squandered their resources in this fashion, the whole Roman culture collapsed ultimately. But the point is that cultural imperialism, biological imperialism overlap, and that we tend to co-evolve or co-devolve with certain organisms. You look at the potato famine. Were it not for the discovery of potatoes in the old world, we would never have the explosion of growth in Europe. But at one point, the relationship failed, and it has a lot to do with monoculture as well. We're setting ourselves up right now for global famine because we're depending, we've destroyed the biodiversity.
No, I totally
you
agree with
understand.
you. Totally.
But here's another example of the Roman Empire. Romans used to be punished, according to historians, by depriving them of wheat rations. So they would be given barley instead, because the two grains the Romans grew were barley and wheat. It explains to you they would either get physical punishment or deprived of wheat rations. That fact alone explains how powerful a neuroendocrine hold that grain has on the body. When you go through withdrawal, it's actually not unlike an opiate withdrawal. The same is true for coffee, incidentally. It contains something called caffestrol, which is in the oil, so it's in the decaf and caffeinated forms, that has 5 times the activity of morphine. So sometimes when people withdraw from caffeine, it's not, coffee, it's not the caffeine withdrawal. If you look at all the opioids we consume in our diet, look at casomorphin, which is cow's milk or cheese. There's a bacteria in your toe that's in Gorgonzola cheese, and we still think it's a divine substance. It's one of the most nastiest substances you consume, but it has the casomorphin peptide. Human breast milk has actual morphine in it, and we produce morphine, even in times of infection as a painkiller. We're one heck of an addicted species. So it's a very interesting argument, but the idea was that we took that leap in evolution to the Neolithic civilization-based society because of the addictive qualities of these grains. Imagine trying to collect a little bit of seed neurotically and maybe consuming it. I don't know if they consume it all the time, but there would have been, it's a very obsessive, which is what culture is. Civilization is extremely obsessive. So the argument is this, is that we don't so much master agriculture as those things we're monoculturing have mastered us. We've taken over their reproductive function. We've completely tried to annihilate the pests for them. We provide them their nourishment. One of my favorite philosophers of all time, Rudolf Hashka, who is responsible, his name is associated with the really wonderful body care line, but he was a philosopher and chemist and alchemist. He said that wheat is a globe-spanning organism. If you look at what's happened with the arable land on this planet, the cereal grains have just completely swallowed it up. And so we are being harvested, and cultured as much as the things we consume. Because again, I could live for the rest of my life without wheat and be extremely happy. It could just disappear overnight, but that's just not how it's going to work. Some people would probably freak out. So what I'm trying to do is disseminate the research. I'm sorry I can't show you right now, but my website has all that data, and I have a ebook that I've created with my lecture series, and then all of the hyperlinks right back to the National Library of Medicine. So it has all the diseases direct to the actual citations, so you can see the connections that we're talking about here. So osteoarthritis was one we talked about, schizophrenia, a lot of things like cerebral ataxia, neuropathy, autism. it's all multifactorial. By no means do I want to portray the concept that there's just one cause, but here's another real important point. People always wonder, well, I've been eating wheat my whole life, so have my ancestors. Why would it cause type 1 diabetes? You know, it's because when you're infected, let's say with a bacteria or virus, they produce specific enzymes that are almost identical in ways to wheat lectin. It's designed to attach to the external slippery coat, which is made of sialic acid. That's what H1N1 is, right? Hemagglutinin type 1, neuraminidase type 1. Neuraminidase is a synonym for sialidase. Breaks down sialic acid. It pierces through that slippery coat, exposing the delicate tissues below, getting entry. Well, that's what lectin does. Now, so if you have an infection, that's already exposed, and then you're consuming these lectin-rich foods, that's when it can grab hold and cause a lot of damage, and then you eat it every day of your life thereafter, and it just sustains that degenerative process. So people that are afflicted with infection, chemical shock, even profound stress, give me 2 days of profound stress, the glutamine will be evaporated, the villi will die, it's almost the same effect. Those lectins will bind to that tissue, get systemic entry, you'll get an autoimmune response, which includes, memory cells, and you'll end up with a sustained issue until you remove that food. So I think everyone on the planet should eliminate wheat and see how they do. And if they feel like they want to reintroduce it, great. That's kind of unrealistic given that there are people starving all over the world. But we're also looking at it philosophically. What's the ideal diet? And wheat is nowhere to be found in that picture. I'm thinking
Nowhere to be found.
in the ideal human diet. Wheat has no place. My real understanding of wheat is it's a form of biological co-option and control of the human body, and it feeds the disease establishment. The whole concept is that the FDA represents the food and drug manufacturers. The food manufacturers make you sick, the drug companies make a literal and figurative killing. No one questions that who sees clearly what's happening. Right. So this
you
is
just hit my hot button.
yeah, well, yeah, you're a Macola subscriber, you must be, That's constantly portrayed there. So, the complexities, any other questions about any of that?
So do you believe that all anti-inflammatory illnesses can be in some way related back to eating wheat?
I allow for an exception because I've been educated by a very wise Ayurvedic practitioner. The Ayurvedic practitioners really don't like my work. They respond without even reading to it. They're just like, that's impossible, But again, they don't allow for what's changed with wheat as well. But yeah, I do think that yes, in many ways, even if we take away the glutens and we take away the lectins, the fact that it's just starch and it's obviously processed is a problem because of the high level of glucose, hidden sugar, as well as obviously the pro-inflammatory fats. No one eats wheat raw, which means they're oxidized fats because they've been cooked, which is even worse. But the real, I guess the real thing would be with the wheat lectin. I forgot what I was going to say.
So do you eat quinoa and millet?
What grains? What
Yeah.
grains?
Well, that's just it.
That's
Okay.
what I want to know right now.
You have these super families, okay? You have the monocotyledonous family, which includes all cereal grasses, okay, one-leafed embryo. You have the dicotyledonous family, which is a two-leafed embryo. Now, those would include things like fruits, right? Seeds, and then it would include things like quinoa, buckwheat, and amaranth.
Oh, what about millet?
No, millet is
Millet's
actually in the monocotyledonous cereal family.
You telling me I gotta throw the millet out that I just
No,
bought?
you don't. Because, realistically, our whole metabolism from the day of birth has been, sort of erected around the consumption of these grains. If you just pull the rug out from under your neuroendocrine history like that, it's not pleasant. Now, you may drop 50 pounds and feel vitally charged for the rest of your life. I mean, they may block you up because you think you're psycho because you have so much energy. Because we really do deaden ourselves with grains, right? Just so we can just shut our mind up, go to sleep. But that's what alcohol does too. It's not like it's really helping us.
It's grains, sugars, dairy, yeah.
Tapioca.
I believe tapioca is not in that family of grain. That's a good question.
Tapioca flours, and it's so
Yeah, interesting. Well, oats are an exception too. Oats are a very unique grain. They actually have been shown to heal intestinal permeability in several studies.
Don't they have gluten in
They have Avenin, which is Prolamin, which according to the Canadian Celiac Society, for example, is okay.
Because I
Last time I
stopped
checked.
eating oatmeal
See that.
because when I gave up gluten.
Right, it's because of cross-contamination, and yes, there may be cross-reactivity among certain genotypes. We don't know for certain, but realistically, there's a lot of value to oats. If you go on my website, again, we have 1,300 substances index. If you go to the oats node, you'll see research on exactly that issue, showing that yes, it is beneficial. We haven't done an exhaustive eval on the topic, but I will say it's a unique, quote, grain I allow for. It doesn't still satisfy me. I still feel like,
It's
yeah.
empty, yeah.
And there is
yeah.
gluten-free, which would just
True.
mean that it's not cross, because I sell it, but
That's a
there-
good one,
Mm,
yeah.
Oh, you at least don't have the cross-contamination in the field, because I believe it either grows in wheat or barley fields or seasons.
Oh, there could
So
be.
one's wheat,
Yeah.
and then the next harvest is oats. And that's the issue, is the cross-contamination, is my understanding. So they had certain farms that they didn't allow to grow the others, so you didn't have the cross-contaminations. However,
Yeah.
someone, especially someone just being diagnosed, I
Yeah.
do inform them you may be able to eat oats.
Sure.
You may not. If you're still having issues,
Yeah.
avoid it. You're kind of gonna have to find out.
Well, the brands that are vetted, gluten-free, like Bob's Red Mill and the other ones,
Right.
excellent. Because then, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty important issue these days.
Rices?
Rice is another
Good
interesting
problem.
one. It does have a glutinous protein. It's not gluten proper, but I find, I mean, it's much safer. So yeah, if you're going, like if you're not, are you not diagnosed with a wheat intolerance? Right, then I would just go wheat-free first, you know, then experiment with some of the alternative grains. Yeah, because you know what happens is our pancreas is swollen just because of all the amylase and all the different enzymes needed to break down those dead grains. So if we just take that away, sometimes it just doesn't feel right. Your body is this big organ just starving for what it's used to. So for some people, it's a more graceful transition. Quinoa, I think, is amazing. It's amazing, yeah. It just tastes so good. It's easy to prepare. It's very high in protein, lysine as well, which is almost absent from grains. So, you know, there's definitely a lot of value there. Yeah. Oh, I didn't even talk about wheat, but wheat has disulfide bonds. Another example why we cannot consume it, because in order to try to break down those very indigestible bonds, you have to secrete a lot of hydrochloric acid. A lot of people have low acid to start with, but talk about gastritis and acid reflux. Paper mache, obviously, it's glue. You can add water and it's like concrete. Vulcanization is how you produce a bowling ball. You just add sulfur to substances that have these disulfide bonds, so you make it even stronger. Human hair, you burn it, it smells like sulfur. That's the kind of protein that gluten is. And casein, by the way, too, in cow's milk. These two glues are just gumming up, just sticky, pasty, constipating, inflammatory in some. It does the opposite, but again, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the animals were monogastric in one stomach. If you take a ruminant with like a cow with four-chambered stomach, at least they could try to break that stuff down by fermenting it. Cow's milk as well, you know, the calf is fermenting and curdling, turning it into yogurt in their stomach. That's why we produce yogurt. That's why we produce sourdough. It's a way to break down proteins we are incapable of breaking down. Now, there is a bacteria in the mouth that actually is capable of breaking down the disulfide bonds in gluten. So certain Europeans who've coexisted long enough have actually developed a certain type of symbiotic relationship with an organism that can do it for them. But it's not necessarily going to do that much. And breastfeeding works to delay or prevent celiac disease because it coats the lining, adding almost another protective coat. So the likelihood of, again, penetration, getting the systemic proteins throughout the system, autoimmune response is very low. Let's see, talked about that. So,
I have a question. I don't want to take you too much away from what you're talking about, but have you noticed, and what is your theory on the issues with the babies now that can't even drink mom's breast milk with
Well,
all the allergies? I mean,
I've
it's
been looking
crazy.
a lot at that, see, because I'm the nutrition director at the birth center in Naples, been doing that for almost 2 years, and I've done a lot of research on the topic. I have a whole section on my site on natural childbirth, and it's all indexing research on the problem, breastfeeding issues. Here's the problem. We are precariously perched on top of the food chain, which means that although we have complete control over all the other organisms and access, we are the most toxic of all creatures. After Fukushima, okay, a few days after, you know, the jet stream brought a lot of the radioisotopes over to California, you could take a Geiger counter to the grass and nothing would be measured. Come back a day or two later and do the milk, exponentially more contamination. It just goes up the food chain, and the highest concentration is in the breast. Now, a lot of this has to do with the same reason why we have high rates of breast cancer, is that the fatty tissue there accumulate fat-soluble, lipophilic poisons. Anything from parabens in your body care products, to an estrogenic petrochemical, to things like, you know, DDT. I mean, go test butter around the planet. You're going to find DDT residues. Estrogen tablets. So that's what happens. So the colic, the spitting up, sometimes that person's body's just toxic. We all have between 1 to 5 grams, I believe it is, of petrochemicals, actual mineral oil, because the Food and Drug Administration allowed for something insane called food grade petroleum. That, you know, it's coating our cucumbers, it's in the candies, and we eat petroleum, and that's considered normal and okay, and it goes into the breast. That's another example. But yes, gliadin and other proteins from wheat can go right through. So what I find is a lot of the women eliminate the wheat or the cow's milk, and sometimes it's okay. But yeah, I think the sad state of affairs is we are probably the most poisoned species on the planet, thanks to the way we behave. So that's a big part of it.
What kind of milk do you like the most?
Oh, I promote like hemp milk, rice milk, oat milk, flax milk, even soy in small amounts. I love talking about soy. The one place where Dr. McCullough and I diverge significantly is on the soy issue. I profoundly respect his view, and you can't support genetically modified soy. But after doing my project, it took me 4 years of indexing research on the topic. I have several hundred studies, many of which are human studies, looking at soy regressing breast cancer, reducing. It's true, and it's because one of the things that we fail to understand, women are victims primarily in the conventional, misogynistic, you know, male medical model. And so after the HRT debacle, we realized that women were sold a false bill of goods, and menopause is not a disease, and you don't treat it with like